What if I told you that the most widely installed operating system inside China's public sector environment is now on a deliberate countdown, and that the intended successor is neither a Linux distribution nor a customized Android fork but Huawei's HarmonyOS Next? What looks on the surface like a software swap is actually a coordinated realignment of policy, hardware supply, developer incentives, and application migration. The only way to judge its real trajectory is to separate what has already happened from what is still only targeted. So I'll keep distinguishing between deployments that are in place, processes that are underway, and objectives still on planning roadmaps, even though the labels will feel less dramatic than headline claims. Why is this acceleration happening now and not 3 years ago? The strategic lessons from 2019 through 2023 hardened gradually. A single external sanction can freeze access to leading-edge components, revoke cloud platform features, or delay critical security updates. That produced internal audits across provinces cataloging points of foreign dependency in operating systems, databases, middleware, and driver stacks. Once those audits matured into procurement red lines, funding under the broader Information Innovation Initiative increased for domestic operating system adaptation, peripheral driver development, and office middleware. Crucially, those funding upticks in mid-2024 lowered execution risk enough for multiple city-level bureaucracies to schedule phased replacements in early 2025. This is path dependency, not a sudden ideological pivot. Execution is being carried by a 3-layer conveyor. Policy and regulatory bodies define security baselines, compliance test batteries, and acceptable procurement criteria. Platform integrators led by Huawei assemble HarmonyOS Next builds. Integrate domestic CPUs like Lungsan, Fidium, and Kunpeng, and close driver gaps. An application adaptation layer of local office suites, communication platforms, workflow tools, and sector-specific software vendors recompile or rewrite against the new APIs. The shift in tempo comes from feedback loop compression. A driver or API mismatch discovered midweek in a municipal tax office can be triaged, patched, and baked into a fresh image for the next procurement batch before the following week's rollouts. Instead of stagnating across quarterly cycles, that weekly cadence is the unglamorous backbone of visible momentum. Under the hood, HarmonyOS Next presents a microkernel plus modular service architecture rather than a large monolithic legacy kernel. The advertised advantages include a smaller attack surface for core privileged services, potential for formal verification on narrow kernel components, and the ability to package only the service modules required by a target device class. Real near-term benefits that have shown up on tuned domestic hardware include faster cold boot, more deterministic scheduling for certain real-time administrative applications, and unified permission mediation across device categories. What it does not instantly deliver is the breadth of peripheral driver coverage accrued over decades on Windows, or immediate parity in GPU compute toolchains for advanced design, simulation, or media production workloads. Architecture is an enabling substrate, not an automatic ecosystem magnet. Adoption is climbing a ladder rather than leaping in a single jump. Early sandbox pilots validated security baselines. Controlled department rollouts introduced small batches into finance and registry offices in selected provinces. Tier 1 city scaling began with administrative clusters in Beijing and Shanghai across the first half of 2025. Horizontal sector expansion toward education, transportation scheduling, and utility monitoring is scheduled rather than fully accomplished. Deep productivity penetration into engineering, advanced design, and simulation workstations lies further out and depends on professional software gaps closing. The latter ordering intentionally front-loads document and workflow scenarios where native app migration cost is lower and tolerance for early friction is higher. To avoid narrative drift, a compact KPI frame helps. 5 indicators matter. First, government and state-owned endpoint penetration. Current qualitative estimates place it in mid-double-digit percentages within early adopting provinces. A sustained level above 60% across 2 consecutive quarters would signal structural rather than experimental adoption. Second, the native port rate among the top 200 domestic apps. Core communication, payment, and office suites have largely rebuilt or recompiled. Specialized professional tools are slower. Crossing 80% including professional productivity would anchor operational sufficiency. Third, developer cohort growth around the HarmonyOS Next SDK. The key test is whether double-digit month-over-month active developer growth can persist for half a year, turning policy push into ecosystem pull. Fourth, the share of public sector PCs shipping with domestic CPUs. New procurement leans heavily domestic while legacy x86 hardware remains in place. A cumulative installed base above half would indicate real hardware stickiness. Fifth, security patch latency compared to Windows baselines. Current pilots are narrowing the gap. Parity across 2 cycles without critical exposure would address risk officer concerns. Leaving some of these cells partially blank is deliberate. It frames the migration as auditable instead of fully claimed. Value realignment follows penetration. Incumbent revenue exposure for Microsoft is concentrated in government and enterprise licensing, which bundles operating system seats, productivity suite attachment, and developer platform gravity. Each retired Windows terminal erodes more than a single license. Intel and AMD encounter a parallel squeeze because new public sector tenders increasingly emphasize domestic instruction sets coupled with operating system synergy. Beneficiaries include domestic CPU vendors locking in predictable volume to iterate performance, local office suites and cloud providers capturing switching subsidies, and integrators monetizing migration services. The strategic prize sought is optionality. Internal policy can ratchet adoption further without renegotiating foreign dependency contracts once sufficient local stack density forms. Momentum narratives, however, veil a set of frictions forming a constraint window of roughly the next 12 to 18 months. High-end GPU and compute stacks for advanced 3D, AI training and simulation still rely on external ecosystems whose rich drivers target Windows and mainstream Linux distributions first. Professional software in domains like CAD, CAE, post-production, EDA, and industrial SCADA lags mainstream Office and communication suites in native support. Legacy middleware embeds Windows-specific dynamic library expectations that are costly to unwind. Interoperability and export compliance questions arise for hardware or software products intended to ship abroad if they depend on a purely domestic stack. Developer retraining imposes transition costs as teams move from assumptions built around Android or generic Linux to HarmonyOS Next APIs. Each friction is resolvable in principle. Timing and resource allocation govern whether resolution arrives before political will or budget patience diminishes. Mitigation trajectories are already visible. Procurement scoring bonuses favor native availability, pushing vendors to prioritize ports. Tax credits and targeted subsidies offset rewrite labor. Compatibility shims and containerization layers keep indispensable legacy binaries alive while stretching their remaining lifespan. Hackathons, certification programs, and public rankings create status incentives around early adoption. These levers do not guarantee speed, but they reduce variance and smooth the adoption curve, increasing the probability that ecosystem self-reinforcement takes over from administrative mandate. A stable dual ecosystem emerges only when switching back becomes economically irrational. That threshold requires operational sufficiency, supply chain stickiness, and narrative self-reinforcement inside organizational risk assessments. Operational sufficiency means administrators and specialized departments can complete daily and peak workload tasks without fallback logins to Windows machines. Supply chain stickiness arrives when hardware, operating system, and middleware procurement bundles are priced, audited, and renewed as a single domestic risk unit. Narrative self-reinforcement forms when reintroducing foreign platforms is framed internally as adding compliance complexity rather than restoring convenience. The first component is mid-journey. The second is accelerating through bundled bids. The third will only harden after an uninterrupted sequence of routine and critical security updates. Looking out over 2026 to 2028, 3 scenario tracks provide structure. An optimistic track would see public sector penetration push beyond 70%, professional design and simulation suites achieving a majority native availability share, and selective international partners experimenting with the stack as a sovereignty signal. A baseline track would plateau near the middle range, specialized software ports remain incomplete, and hybrid dual stack workarounds persist behind the scenes. A reversal track would feature persistent GPU and toolchain bottlenecks, rising migration maintenance costs, and a normalization of pragmatic mixed deployments that cool the strategic narrative into situational replacement. Current evidence places the system early on the horizontal axis because professional software coverage and patch latency parity have not yet locked in.